All right. So we left off on the Plant Diversity 2 chapter, which was what, chapter 30? Yeah. And we just finished talking about conifers, right? Noting that juniper berries are in fact not berries, nor are they even fruits. They're just fleshy, fruit-like scales on a gymnosperm. Okay. But speaking of fruits, we are now going to talk about the one clade that does bear real actual fruits, which are angiosperms. And as mentioned earlier, angiosperms are the most widespread and diverse of all plants. They are a monophyletic clade. And they all fall into one phylum, which is Anthophyta, and anthos in Greek meaning flower. And they have two key features, right? So if you look back at the gymnosperm section, gymnosperms, we list a whole bunch of features that they share, and they share all of those with angiosperms. But in addition, angiosperms have these two adaptations, which are flowers and fruits. Okay. The flower is a structure that's specialized in facilitating sexual reproduction for the angiosperm, and a lot of species are pollinated by insects or other animals, and some even deceptively, right? So they actually use deception to facilitate pollination, and some species are wind pollinated. Okay, so let's watch a video of these guys.
Lots of animals are known for their wily ways, but other forms of life also have a few tricks up their sleeves. Since they spend most of their lives anchored to one spot, plants can't exactly run away if they're attacked, and they often need to convince more mobile critters to help them interact with their mates. So some species use deception to get what they want. By dressing up like other plants or smelling like an attractive mate, the plants on this list can trick all sorts of smarter species. Even us. You might not like it when someone says you look like poop, but if the seeds of the South African RESTIAD could think, they would probably consider that the ultimate compliment. An unassuming, grassy-looking plant, the RESTIAD goes to great lengths to dress its seed up as feces. Eland antelope feces, to be precise. It's an attempt to trick dung beetles into doing the hard work of moving their seeds around. Plants need space to grow, so seeds need some way to get out of their parents' shadows, quite literally. Many can rely on small mammals that hoard seeds, but there aren't many good hoarders in the South African shrublands where these RESTIAD plants live. Apparently, dung beetles are the next best thing. The beetles in question both consume antelope feces and use it as a cozy little nursery for their babies. So when they find a nice turd, they quickly roll it to an opportune spot and bury it for later. The plant seeds look and smell strongly like antelope poop, enough to fool the beetles anyway, which roll and bury the seeds some distance from their parent plants. The burying also protects the seeds while they germinate, so the plants can rebound quickly after fires burn through the dry landscape. Meanwhile, the poor beetles end up with nothing for their labors. The common lungwort also does its best poop impression, but for the exact opposite reason. To deter animals that might otherwise munch on them, they make their leaves look like a Jackson Pollock, if he painted with bird droppings. Most plant eaters steer clear of leaves covered in droppings for the same reason you wouldn't want bird poop all over your salad. Droppings don't really provide any nutritional value, might not taste so great, and could contain diseases or parasites. And the lungwort's ruse might even work on smaller leaf chewers like caterpillars that have a lot to lose if hungry birds are around. It's possible the patches are meant to mimic fungal damage instead of bird poop, but either way, the ultimate message is the same. Don't eat these leaves. They're gross and potentially pathogenic. White patches are relatively cheap as far as defenses go, though not entirely free. The blotches can't photosynthesize, so spotted leaves can't produce as much fuel as unspotted ones would. Even so, the plant's poop-like patterns are the most intense when they're growing in darkly shaded spots, perhaps because the lower light means they can't afford to lose as many leaves. And a few light patches of bird poop aren't enough, I guess. Pebble plants get their name because they look like pebbles, which turns out to be a great way not to get eaten because pretty much nothing eats rocks. They're a kind of succulent, juicy plants that store water in their tissues, allowing them to eke out a living in lands too dry for most plants. That water makes them a prime target for all kinds of thirsty animals, in addition to the hungry ones. So they disguise themselves like rocks. Their pebbly shape is made by pairs of leaves folded inward, creating a sort of inverted pyramid. Those leaves are adept at absorbing water from fog, dew, and rain, which is then stored in the plant's fleshy interior. Meanwhile, calcium oxalate crystals in the plant's outer layer give it a stony gray exterior, while reddish pigments in its tissues help it perfectly match the pebbles around it. This kind of simple mimicry of something unpalatable is known as Batesian mimicry, and those certainly aren't the only plants that employ it. But they're just so much better at playing pebbles than anything else. It's not until the fall, when their daisy-esque flowers bloom, that they reveal their plantishness. Blending in has lots of advantages, and no plant has mastered the art of camouflage better than the chameleon vine, a climbing vine found in South America. Every other plant on this list is limited to one costume, whereas these vines can reshape themselves to mimic at least 8 different plants. They can even have different leaf shapes in different parts of the exact same vine. This rare ability to don multiple costumes is called mimetic polymorphism, and it's otherwise only known in butterflies. The plant is somehow able to alter just about every trait of its leaves, from their size and shape to their spininess and even patterns of veins, which does a great job of hiding the vines from hungry mouths. The thing is, no one knows how the plant figures out what to look like. It changes its leaves even when it's not in direct contact with the plant it's mimicking, and it's not like they have eyeballs to see what to mimic, or do they? A 2016 paper revived an old and controversial idea that these and other plants may be able to, quote, see things like color and shapes through light-sensing structures called ocelli, but no one has investigated these in the chameleon vine specifically. Other researchers think it's more likely the vines pick up on chemical signals from nearby plants, and somehow translate the pattern of compounds into the right leaf size, shape, and color. But no one has ever found an airborne chemical that induces this vine, or any other plant for that matter, to change its physical leaf traits this way. So exactly how it pulls off its incredible deception remains a mystery. The Asian dancing plant is a favorite of gardeners for its unique mobile leaflets, which make elliptical patterns every few minutes. These smooth moves are thanks to a special ring-shaped organ at the base of each leaflet called the pulvinus. Its cells can swell or shrink by controlling their water intake, allowing the leaflet to swerve around. Sunlight and warmth seem to speed their movements up, and some people swear they dance in response to music, suggesting that some kind of vibratory cue could be in play. Why they do this at all, though, has perplexed scientists for centuries. Today, some researchers think they're mimicking butterflies, trying to imitate the subtle wing shifts butterflies make when they're resting in the sun. And that might be because butterfly larvae are a big problem for many plants, and butterflies don't like to crowd their young. So it's possible the dancing leaves protect the plant by making it appear occupied to butterfly moms, basically pretending that this prime real estate is already taken. Another suggestion is that the leaves attract various creatures that eat butterflies or other winged insects. If those predators are hanging around, they can snack on any actual insects that try to munch on the plant. Or the plants could have bouncing leaves for some other unknown reason, because the butterfly hypothesis hasn't been well tested. But it makes a lot more sense than the idea that they just like to boogie to a good beat. So far, we've seen plants that deceive to disperse their seeds, and others that disguise themselves to avoid being eaten. But there's another reason a plant might want to lie, and it's one that some people can probably relate to find a mate. Many plants rely on pollinators to help them do that. And sure, they could lure helpful animals in with a tasty nectar treat, but those sugary rewards are costly. So lots of plants employ more nefarious tactics, especially orchids, which sometimes disguise their flowers as insects eager for a mate. Take the hammer orchids of Australia, for example. One petal is modified into a hammer-like labellum that's shaped, colored, textured, and scented like a female wasp. This part is connected to the rest of the flower with a hinge, so when a male wasp lands and starts mating with the decoy, it swings and slams him into the flower's pollen. When the unlucky bachelor falls for the same trick again on another orchid, the pollen is jammed right where the orchid needs it. Orchids aren't the only plants that trick pollinators, though. Aroids, a family of flowering plants, have also mastered the art of olfactory deception. And one of the most impressive examples is a species of American pipevine. It's so named because its flowers bear a vague resemblance to an old-fashioned pipe, but that's not what they look like to the small biting flies that pollinate them. These flies, or no-see-ums as they're often called, feed on mammalian blood, so they jump at the chance to nestle into a nice, cozy rodent or rabbit ear with its easy-to-access flesh full of juicy capillaries and veins to drink from. That's why the flowers are somewhat ear-shaped and furry-looking, they emit a musty odor, and are mottled with blood-vessel-y pinks and browns. When a fly touches down inside this fake ear, the slick surface sends it barreling into the pipe where it's trapped by backwards-facing hairs. It can remain stuck there for days while the plant covers it in pollen. Then the hairs wilt, and the fly is freed, hopefully, to find another fake ear and deliver that pollen. The last plant on this list earned its spot for one big reason. The species it tricks is us. This grass is considered one of the world's worst weeds, and one variety is almost indistinguishable from rice. But it wasn't always. Barnyard grass originated in Asia, where it was quite at home in damp habitats. But then agriculture took the world by storm, and around 12,000 years ago, people basically everywhere started farming crops like rice. Those well-maintained, periodically flooded fields were the perfect habitat. But their farmers disagreed and set about plucking the grassy weeds out by hand whenever they saw them, which put a very specific kind of evolutionary pressure on the weed to blend in. If the weed was growing in a hand-weeded rice paddy, it was more likely to get missed if it looked a bit more like rice. And over the centuries, a new growth form emerged. This variant of the weed has seedlings that look almost identical to rice seedlings thanks to their size, coloration, and more erect leaves. And the mimic weed's seeds are 2 to 3 times as heavy as the seeds of its kin, much more like the size and shape of rice grains. In fact, the weed looks more like rice than it does other members of its species. This case of mimicry is especially stunning because barnyard grass isn't even closely related to the rice it pretends to be. So unlike other crop mimicking weeds, it didn't steal genes from the rice to look more like it. And unlike other plants on this list, its tricks aren't meant for some beetle or cud-chewing herbivore. They're meant for, and work on, us. It may not be the flashiest example of deceit, but it's certainly the most personal. Whether they're fooling a rice farmer or a dung beetle, all the examples on this list should give you some idea of just how tricky plants can be, which just goes to show that you don't need a brain to deceive, and evolution can produce some pretty incredible liars. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help us keep making videos like this and get access to cool rewards like exclusive blooper reels, just head over to patreon.com/scishow.
All right. So as you can tell, right, there are lots of different ways for plants to be deceptive. Some of them involve having floral structures that deceive either visually or even olfactorily, right, with odors or pheromones. Okay, let's look at flower structure in a little more detail now. So flowers, a perfect or complete flower has 4 different specialized types of shoots or leaves. So these modified leaves are sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Sepals enclose the flower. Petals are the brightly colored leaves that attract pollinators. Stamens produce pollen. Carpels produce ovules. Okay, let's look at carpels and stamens in a little more detail. So a stamen, it looks an awful lot like moss sporophytes almost, right? It's not in any way like that, but it structurally looks similar, right? So a stamen consists of a stalk. The stalk is called a filament, and there's a sac called an anther at the end of the stalk, okay? And inside that anther, pollen gets produced. Remember, pollen develops into the male gametophyte, which contains sperm. Okay. A carpel is this whole structure, okay, and that consists of an ovary. This is the ovary at the base, a style, which is right here, leading up to a stigma, which is the part of the structure that receives pollen. Okay, so an ovary contains many ovules. Remember, ovules house the megaspore that matures into the female gametophyte and then ultimately into eggs. Okay, let's watch a video about fruit development next.
When seeds are mature enough, the ovaries change their function and develop into seed-dispersing structures called fruits. There are many patterns of fruit development, depending on the number of carpels, ovaries, and flowers that form one fruit. Fruits can also be divided into the categories of dry fruits and fleshy fruits. In dry fruits, the ovary dries out at maturity. It may develop hooks that catch animal fur, as in this example. Or the ovary and other flower parts may form a wing or a parasol or hairs to catch the wind. Sometimes the dry ovary builds tensions that, when released, will shoot the seeds into the air. In fleshy fruits such as tomatoes and peaches, the outer tissues of the ovary thicken and become soft, sweet, and brightly colored. Fleshy fruits invite animal dispersal, The seeds are ingested and, if they escape digestion, they are excreted with fertilizer, hopefully in a choice location.
All right. So, as mentioned, right, we get dry fruits and fleshy fruits, right? And dried fruits, a lot of nuts and things like that are actually dried fruits. Okay, let's switch back to flowers for a second. So flowers, not all flowers have all four of those leaf structures that we talked about. If they do have sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels, they're called complete. But some flowers actually lack one or more of those, and those are called incomplete flowers. Doesn't mean they're broken or non-functional, it just means that they didn't need that leaf structure and they're doing just fine without it. Okay. We'll also talk about symmetry, and we'll get to talking about symmetry a lot when we get to the animal chapters as well, right? But flowers have two kinds of symmetry, radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. And radial symmetry means that like any way you slice this flower, it's a mirror image of itself. Okay, bilateral symmetry means that there's only one way to slice the flower to see a mirror image of it, right? So if we were to slice the flower this way, it would not be symmetrical. Only on this axis is it symmetrical. Okay. Let's ignore these parts of the image because they'll be on the next slide, right? So we're just looking at symmetry here. We'll talk more about comparing radial versus bilateral symmetry in a couple of slides. Okay, so most species have flowers where the stamen and the carpel are both functional in the same flower, okay? And those flowers are hermaphroditic, right? They can make both male and female gametes on the same flower structure, okay? Some flowers actually have, or some plants have different kinds of flowers on the same plant. Some of those flowers have carpels but no stamens, and other flowers on the same plant have stamens but no carpels. Right, so there's basically male and female flowers on the same plant on different parts of the plant. So those are called monoecious plants, and plants that have only male flowers on one entire individual plant and only female flowers on a different entire individual plant. Those are called dioecious, right? So there are male and female plants. Hollies are a good example of dioecious. And here's what some fruits look like. So a fruit, again, is formed when the ovary wall thickens and matures. So remember, an ovary contains many ovules, which become seeds. So fruit can contain more than one seed. Fruits protect seeds, aid in their dispersal. So whether that dispersal is through the gut of an animal, through the wind, on the fur coat of an animal, doesn't matter, right? No matter what, the fruit structure is there to facilitate dispersal. Okay, and again, you can either have dry or fleshy. Here are some dried fruits. Here are some fleshy fruits. Okay, we've got structures in the fruit that help propel or disperse seeds by explosive action. We've got some that facilitate wind dispersal. Some get passed through the digestive tract of animals and are dispersed that way, and some that latch on, this poor dog, to animals and get carried around that way. So remember that the female gametophyte, which is called an embryo sac, develops into within the ovule. Okay, an ovary contains more than one ovule, and that's at the base of the stigma in the carpel. Right. So remember, the stigma is the tube of the carpel, and at the base of it, it's almost like a vase. Right. It's got that cul-de-sac type structure, and that's the ovary. Okay. A lot of flowers have mechanisms that ensure cross-pollination between different individuals of the same population. Okay, so monoecious plants do this pretty well. they could just time the flowering of their male flowers versus their female flowers slightly differently. Dioecious plants have to cross-pollinate because the same individual doesn't make both male and female flowers. Okay, but even a lot of hermaphroditic flowers, right? Flowers that make both pollen and ovules can actually prevent self-pollination, self-fertilization. One of the ways that plants can do this is through what are called self-incompatibility loci. So there are literally genes that are expressed in the carpel tissue and in pollen tissue, where the proteins on the surface of that pollen tube actually interact with proteins in the carpel tissue and prevent the pollen tube from growing all the way down into the ovules. So it basically recognizes alleles that are the same inside the carpel tissue and inside the pollen tissue, and basically prevent pollen tubes from growing far. And then if the allele is different, then that interaction is permitted. Okay, so there are lots of self-incompatibility loci in plants. It's worth a Google search. There are quite a few self-incompatibility genes that are known out there. So assuming that they are compatible, the pollen and the ovule, what happens is the pollen grain lands on the stigma, germinates, the pollen tube of the male gametophyte grows down into the ovary. And remember, an ovule has a little pore, a little opening called the micropyle, and the pollen tube grows through that micropyle and discharges sperm into the female gametophyte within the ovule. Okay? So once those sperm are inside the female gametophyte, one of them fertilizes the egg, and the other actually combines with two nuclei that are in a central cell in the female gametophyte, forming a triploid, what's called endosperm, right? Which basically nourishes the embryo. So if you have a popcorn kernel, right, all of the white tissue that is the popcorn after the popping process proceeds, that's all endosperm, right? It's starchy, it's sweet to us, right? So that was what was going to supply nutrients to the growing embryo. So once you have an embryo inside a seed, that embryo consists of a root, and then seed leaves called cotyledons. Okay, so here are cotyledons. And next up, we're going to see a life cycle, but I'll do that in a different video.